On a hill above a quiet Massachusetts town, above the church steeples and the college greens of Northampton, there once stood a building so large it was said to have its own weather. Locals called it simply the Hill or the Hospital, or later, when the stories grew darker, they didn't call it anything at all. They just looked away. It was built in the middle of the 1800s on a promise that sounds almost gentle today, that beauty could calm a troubled mind, that fresh air, wide lawns, tall windows, and quiet order could do what chains and cellars never could. For a while, people believed it. Families believed it enough to hand over sons, daughters, mothers, and husbands, trusting that the hill would give them back whole. And for 135 years, the hospital kept growing, wing after wing, ward after ward, as if the answer to every failure was simply to build more. But behind the tall windows, the promise quietly broke. Patients arrived faster than beds could be built for them. Cures gave way to warehousing. And on a forgotten slope just outside the hospital walls, hundreds of men and women were buried without headstones, without dates, in most cases without so much as a name to mark that they had lived at all. This is the story of Northampton State Hospital, a place built to heal the mind that ultimately became one of the least remembered graveyards in America. Chapter 1. A Hill Chosen for Healing. To understand why a hospital rose on this particular hillside, you have to understand the fear and shame that came before it. In the early 1840s, a Boston schoolteacher named Dorothea Dix walked into a jail to teach a Sunday class and found a woman chained in an unheated cell, stripped of clothing and left with nothing, kept there simply because no one knew what else to do with her. Dix spent the following years traveling town to town across Massachusetts, documenting what she found in cellars, barns, and jail cells across the state. Her report to the Massachusetts legislature described men and women held in chains, confined like livestock, and denied even basic shelter. And it shocked enough lawmakers into action that the state began funding a new kind of institution, one built not to punish the mentally ill, but to treat them. Reformers of the era believed in something called moral treatment, the idea that a calm environment, structured routine, honest work, and architectural beauty could soothe a suffering mind in ways that chains never could. A physician named Thomas Story Kirkbride became the movement's most influential voice, laying out design principles for hospitals with soaring windows, symmetrical wings, and sweeping views, buildings meant to feel less like prisons and more like sanctuaries. It was this philosophy that would eventually bring builders to a quiet hillside outside Northampton, Massachusetts. The site itself was chosen with almost romantic intention. Perched above the town, the hill offered sweeping views of the Connecticut River Valley, distant mountains, and open farmland, exactly the kind of scenery reformers believed could calm a troubled mind. Fresh air moved freely across the ridge, and the soil was fertile enough to support the working farms that moral treatment demanded. Even the elevation carried symbolism, a literal rise above the noise and crowding of ordinary life. State officials approved the project as the third hospital of its kind in Massachusetts, joining an earlier facility in Worcester and another under construction in Taunton, both already straining under more patients than they were ever built to hold. Northampton was meant to relieve that pressure, to offer a fresh start, built on lessons the state believed it had already learned. From the very first sketches, the building was designed to be seen as much as it was designed to heal. Its wings would stretch outward from a central hub, in a shape some later described as resembling a great bat with open wings, each ward carefully staggered so that sunlight and air could reach every room. It was meant to be the physical embodiment of hope itself, a structure so thoughtfully built that its very walls would participate in a patient's recovery. Newspapers of the era wrote about the project with genuine excitement, describing it as proof that the state was finally treating its most vulnerable citizens with dignity. No one standing on that hillside in the planning stages could have imagined what the building would eventually become, or how completely its noble intentions would be buried beneath the weight of the very growth it was designed to accommodate. But the ground had been chosen, the philosophy had been settled, and all that remained now was to build. Chapter 2. Breaking Ground on Hospital Hill. Construction began on the 15th of March, 1856, when the first crews arrived on the hillside outside Northampton to clear land. The work was slow and physically brutal, carried out largely by hand and by horse-drawn equipment, as laborers cut into the hillside to level ground for a building whose scale had never before been attempted in this part of the state. Timber arrived by wagon in staggering quantities. Stone had to be quarried and hauled up the incline. Local workers found themselves employed on what quickly became one of the largest construction projects Western Massachusetts had ever seen. For a small farming town like Northampton, the sight of this rising structure was almost impossible to ignore. It dominated the skyline before it was even finished, a skeleton of timber and stone that grew taller and wider with each passing month. On the 4th of July, 1856, the same day the nation celebrated its 80th year of independence, the builders paused their work for a ceremony befitting the optimism of the project. Local dignitaries, physicians, and reform advocates gathered on the hillside to lay the cornerstone, a formal ritual meant to mark the beginning of something the state believed would change the lives of its most vulnerable citizens. Inside that cornerstone, the builders sealed a time capsule, a small collection of documents, pamphlets, and printed materials meant to speak to a future generation about the intentions behind the hospital's founding. No one gathered that day could have known the cornerstone would remain undisturbed for 150 years, silently holding its message while the building around it transformed almost beyond recognition. The ceremony captured perfectly the spirit of the era, a belief that this was not merely a building project, but a moral one. An act of collective conscience meant to prove that a modern, humane society no longer needed to hide its suffering in jail cells and attics. As construction continued, the building began to take the shape its architects had envisioned. At its heart stood a central administrative section, tall and formal, flanked on either side by long wings that stretched outward and staggered back in a stepped pattern, designed to maximize sunlight and airflow in every ward. Locals began referring to the growing structure as Old Main, a nickname that would follow it for the rest of its existence. The exterior was built largely of brick, solid and imposing, with tall windows meant to flood the interior with natural light. A deliberate architectural choice rooted in the belief that darkness itself could worsen mental illness. Wide covered porches wrapped around portions of the building, intended as spaces where patients could sit outdoors without leaving the safety of hospital grounds. Nothing about the design was accidental. Every hallway, every window placement, every sweeping view toward the distant hills was meant to serve the larger goal of calming the mind through calming surroundings. Newspapers covering the project treated it with genuine civic pride. One regional publication described the effort as proof that the harsh, unchristian spirit that once governed the treatment of the mentally ill was finally giving way to something gentler and more humane. Editors and reformers alike wrote about the hospital as a symbol of progress, a physical demonstration that the state took seriously its responsibility towards citizens who had previously been chained in cellars or left to wander the roads. There was a widespread sense that Massachusetts was leading the nation into a more compassionate era, and that this building, rising brick by brick above Northampton, would stand as living evidence of that shift. Construction continued for roughly 2 years, an enormous undertaking for the period, as crews worked through New England winters and humid summers to complete a structure meant to house hundreds of patients under a single expansive roof. By the time the final touches were added, the building sprawled across the hillside like nothing the region had ever seen, its brick facade catching the afternoon light, its tall windows staring out over the valley below. It was, by every outward measure, a triumph of intention. What no one yet understood was how quickly that triumph would begin to strain under the weight of its own success, or how soon the calm, orderly vision imagined in blueprints and cornerstone ceremonies would collide with the messier reality of human need. Chapter 3. The doors open and immediately overflow. On the 16th of August, 1858, the doors of Northampton State Hospital opened to receive its first patients. The original design had specified a maximum capacity of 200 patients, a number chosen to preserve the very ideals moral treatment depended on: individual attention, quiet wards, and a sense of order rather than crowding. But even before a single patient arrived, that number had already begun to slip. State hospital commissioners, anticipating demand they could already see building elsewhere in the system, raised the limit from 200 to 250 before the first bed was ever filled. It was a small adjustment on paper, but it revealed something the coming decades would prove again and again, that no matter how carefully the building was designed, the need would always outpace it. The reality that followed was staggering. Within 6 weeks of opening its doors, the hospital's population had already reached 220 patients. Most of them not new admissions from the local community, but transfers. Men and women shipped in from other institutions on the eastern side of the state that had themselves become dangerously overcrowded. Northampton had been built as a pressure release valve for a system already straining under demand, and it began absorbing that pressure from its very first weeks of operation. Wagons and carriages arrived carrying patients from facilities in Worcester and beyond, institutions that had been open for decades and had long since exceeded any reasonable definition of capacity. The hospital, charged with pioneering a gentler, more spacious approach to care, found itself immediately facing the exact overcrowding it had been built to solve. The response from hospital leadership captured the strange optimism and denial that would come to define much of the institution's history. After only 2 months of operation, with the population already testing the limits of the revised cap, the Board of Trustees speculated that the hospital could reasonably accommodate as many as 300 patients. There was no structural change to justify this new figure, no expansion of wards or addition of staff to match it. It was simply an acknowledgement that the hospital would need to absorb far more people than anyone had planned for, and that the building itself would have to bend to meet that need rather than the other way around. For the patients themselves, arrival at Northampton meant stepping into a building still radiant with the optimism of its founding vision: tall windows, wide porches, sweeping views of the valley below, even as the wards behind those windows filled faster than anyone had anticipated. Attendants and physicians, trained under the principles of moral treatment, still believed deeply in the mission of the place, in fresh air, honest work, and calm surroundings as genuine paths toward healing. But the mathematics of the situation were already working against them. A hospital designed around the needs of 200 patients was, within its first 2 months of existence, being asked to plan for 300, with no corresponding growth in the physical space meant to hold them. It was a quiet, almost invisible crisis, buried beneath ceremonial optimism and hopeful newspaper coverage, but it marked the beginning of a tension between capacity and need that would define Northampton State Hospital for the rest of its existence. Chapter 4: The House of Earle. The hospital's first superintendent resigned in 1864, worn down by the same overcrowding that had haunted the institution since its opening. His replacement was a man named Dr. Pliny Earle, and his arrival would come to define the hospital's identity for more than 2 decades. Earle was an internationally respected figure, a physician who had studied asylums across Europe and returned to America steeped in the principles of moral treatment. He believed in the same gentle philosophy that had shaped the hospital's founding, the idea that structure, purposeful labor, and a calm environment could genuinely ease the suffering of a troubled mind. Almost immediately upon taking charge, Earle began expanding the hospital's work therapy program, growing the farm, constructing a greenhouse, and establishing a network of service-oriented buildings that gave patients meaningful daily labor rather than idle confinement. Under his direction, the hospital grounds became something closer to a working village, with orchards, gardens, and livestock, tended largely by the patients themselves. But Earle's most significant legacy was not what he built. It was what he refused to believe. As the years passed, he grew increasingly troubled by claims circulating through the psychiatric profession. Bold assertions from rival institutions claiming cure rates as high as 70 or even 100% for patients suffering from insanity. These numbers were being used to justify continued public funding, continued construction, and continued public confidence in the asylum system as a whole. Earle, unlike many of his contemporaries, decided to actually investigate these claims rather than simply repeat them. What he found disturbed him deeply. the statistics he discovered were riddled with methodological dishonesty. Patients counted multiple times across multiple admissions. Recoveries claimed without any real follow-up. Numbers massaged to support conclusions the data simply did not justify. In the early 1880s, Earle published his findings in a book titled The Curability of Insanity, a work that directly challenged the foundational optimism of the entire asylum movement. He wrote that any estimate claiming 50, 60, 70, or even 75% of patients could be reliably cured and returned to productive life was a delusion and a snare. It was a stunning position for a sitting superintendent to take, and it placed Earle in direct conflict with celebrated figures of the era, including Dr. Edward Jarvis, a man Earle had personally known and who had stood beside him at the laying of Northampton's own cornerstone decades earlier. Earle also turned his criticism toward the physical scale of asylums themselves, singling out what he called the culpable wastefulness of the builders of Danvers State Hospital, an institution originally designed to house 500 patients that had swelled to 700 within just a few years of opening. In doing so, Earle was describing the exact trajectory that Northampton itself was already following and would continue to follow for the next century. He understood that the asylum system was not curing insanity at the rate it claimed, and that continued expansion was not a sign of therapeutic success, but a symptom of a system quietly failing to keep pace with need. Earle served as superintendent for 21 years, retiring in 1885. By the time he stepped down, the hospital's population had grown to 476 patients, more than double what the original architects had ever intended the building to hold. In gratitude for his decades of service, the hospital trustees granted him a private apartment within the asylum itself, allowing him to remain on the grounds he had shaped for so long. There is a quiet, almost haunting irony in that arrangement. A man who had spent years warning that asylums were being overbuilt and oversold, spending his final years living peacefully inside the very institution whose growth he had so carefully documented and so publicly doubted. Earle's tenure represents perhaps the last moment in Northampton's history when honest self-examination still had a real voice within the hospital's own walls. In the decades that followed his retirement, that voice would grow quieter, drowned out by ever-expanding wards, ever-rising patient counts, and an institutional momentum that no single superintendent would be able to slow. Chapter 5: A Town Unto Itself. By the closing years of the 1800s, Northampton State Hospital had grown into something far larger than a single medical institution. It had become a self-contained town, complete with its own economy, workforce, and rhythms of daily life entirely separate from the community below the hill. The hospital maintained sprawling gardens and orchards, producing enough fruit and vegetables to help feed the growing population housed within its walls. A working farm supplied dairy and livestock. A greenhouse kept flowers and produce growing through the harsh New England winters. Eventually, the hospital operated its own slaughterhouse and cannery, processing and preserving food entirely on-site, a level of self-sufficiency that meant the institution rarely needed to look beyond its own grounds to sustain itself. This self-sufficiency extended well beyond food production. The hospital employed hundreds of workers across dozens of roles: groundskeepers, attendants, nurses, cooks, farmhands, tradesmen, and administrators. And many of these employees did not simply work on the hill, they lived there. Staff dormitories housed unmarried workers, while separate housing accommodated married couples who built entire careers, and in some cases, entire family lineages, within the hospital's walls. Children of hospital employees grew up on the grounds, attending local schools in town, but returning each evening to a home nestled among the wards and outbuildings of the institution. For these families, the hospital was not a distant, foreboding place. It was simply home, a sprawling campus of brick buildings, gardens, and open fields that happened to also house hundreds of patients living with mental illness. The hospital developed its own social infrastructure as well, a reflection of just how thoroughly it had become woven into the daily life of everyone connected to it. Employees organized baseball teams that competed against one another and against teams from the surrounding town, turning summer afternoons on the hospital grounds into genuine community events. Dances and social gatherings brought staff together in the evenings, offering a sense of normalcy and camaraderie that stood in stark contrast to the suffering unfolding in the wards nearby. A steady stream of wagons and, later, automobiles traveled the road, connecting the hospital to downtown Northampton, carrying workers, supplies, and visitors up and down the hill in a constant flow of traffic that made the institution feel less like an isolated asylum and more like a bustling extension of the town itself. For much of the surrounding region, the hospital represented steady, reliable employment, some of the best paying and most stable jobs available in the entire Connecticut River Valley. And yet, beneath this veneer of small-town normalcy, an uncomfortable truth persisted. The very completeness of the hospital's self-sufficiency, its farms, dormitories, and social clubs, meant that patients could live out entire lifetimes within its walls without any meaningful contact with the world beyond the hill. The institution had built a fully functioning society for its staff, while simultaneously constructing an isolated world for its patients, two populations sharing the same grounds, but experiencing profoundly different realities. Workers came and went freely, built families, and eventually retired with decades of memories tied to the place. Patients often arrived and simply disappeared into the institution's rhythms, their contact with the outside world growing thinner with each passing year. What had begun as a philosophy of open windows, fresh air, and connection to the natural world had evolved into something closer to a closed ecosystem, increasingly separate from the community it had been built to serve. Chapter 6. The Turn of the Century. As the 1800s gave way to the 1900s, the hospital itself seemed to shed its old identity along with the old century. It had opened its doors under the name Northampton Lunatic Hospital, a label that reflected the blunt, unsentimental language of its founding era. By the turn of the century, it had been renamed the Northampton Insane Hospital, and just 2 years later, it took on the name it would carry for the remainder of its existence, Northampton State Hospital. These changes were more than cosmetic. They reflected a slow, uneven shift in how American society spoke about mental illness, a gradual retreat from the harsher language of earlier decades toward terminology that sounded more clinical and less condemning. Yet the underlying reality on the hillside remained largely unchanged. Whatever the institution called itself, its wards kept filling faster than its walls could expand. Under the leadership of Superintendent John A. Houston, construction on the hill never truly paused. New stables rose in 1900, followed by a cow barn in 1902. That same period saw the construction of substantial new infirmary wards built onto either end of the original hospital structure, massive additions completed in 1902 and 1903 respectively. These were not modest expansions. The South Infirmary, built specifically to house women, was designed as a significant enlargement of the hospital's total capacity. And yet, the building filled to capacity almost the moment it opened its doors. The hospital's own trustees, writing in their annual report that same year, acknowledged with evident frustration that the number of patients under their care vastly exceeded the space, staff, and resources available to properly care for them, warning that conditions were likely to worsen even with the newly completed buildings for women and additional construction already planned for men. It was against this backdrop of chronic, seemingly permanent overcrowding that one of the most quietly damning documents in the hospital's history emerged, though not from within its own walls. In 1907, a former patient named Clifford W. Beers published a book titled A Mind That Found Itself. Beers had endured confinement in several different institutions and used his memoir to make a claim that struck directly at the foundation of the entire asylum system, arguing that, contrary to what the public had been led to believe for more than half a century, no one, not physicians, not superintendents, not the celebrated architects of moral treatment, actually knew how to reliably cure insanity. His book would go on to spark a national mental hygiene movement, forcing uncomfortable public conversations about institutions like Northampton. That same year, the hospital's population stood at 726 patients, nearly 4 times the number the original architects had ever intended the building to hold. The contrast could hardly have been sharper. elegant lampposts lighting pathways between wards that were quietly, steadily, becoming as overcrowded and strained as anything Dorothea Dix had once fought to eliminate. Chapter 7: Memorial Complex and the Flood. By the middle of the 1920s, hospital administrators could no longer treat overcrowding as a temporary problem to be managed year by year. It had become the defining, permanent condition of the institution, and in 1925, the state approved what would become the single largest expansion in the hospital's history, a new construction effort known as Memorial Complex. Unlike the incremental additions of previous decades, small wards tacked onto the edges of Old Main, Memorial Complex was conceived from the outset as an entirely separate campus, purpose-built to accommodate up to 1,000 patients on its own. It represented a tacit admission from the state that the original building could never truly keep pace with the demand being placed upon it. Construction on Memorial Complex unfolded over several years, and as the new buildings rose, they quickly became the true center of gravity for the hospital's operations. Where Old Main had once stood as the singular, defining structure on the hillside, Memorial Complex now absorbed the bulk of new construction, new expansions, and eventually the majority of daily hospital activity. It was a newer, more modern facility, built with the benefit of decades of institutional experience, and for a brief period, it seemed to offer genuine relief from the chronic overcrowding that had plagued the hospital since its earliest weeks of operation. But that relief proved painfully short-lived. By 1935, just a decade after construction began, the hospital's total population had swollen to more than 2,100 patients, a number that dwarfed even the most generous capacity estimates the trustees had floated back in the 1850s. The pattern that had defined Northampton from its very first months was repeating itself on a scale no one could have imagined when the cornerstone was laid nearly 70 years earlier. The physical consequences of this relentless growth were visible everywhere across the hillside. Old Main itself had by this point been expanded, modified, and built onto so many times that its original batwing silhouette, so carefully designed to maximize sunlight and airflow, had become almost entirely unrecognizable. Wings had been extended, new wards had been grafted onto existing structures, hallways connected buildings that had never been part of the same original blueprint. What had once been a single coherent architectural statement about the healing power of thoughtful design had become something closer to an accumulation, decades of desperate improvisation layered on top of an idealistic foundation. Smaller auxiliary buildings sprang up around the main campus as well. Hastily constructed structures meant to absorb overflow that the primary buildings simply could not contain. There is a particular kind of tragedy embedded in this chapter of the hospital's history, one that had little to do with any single villain or moment of obvious cruelty. Memorial Complex had been built with real intention, resources, and institutional hope that this expansion might finally solve the problem of overcrowding once and for all. Instead, it became simply the next chapter in an unbroken cycle stretching back to the hospital's very first weeks of operation. Each generation of administrators inherited the same fundamental miscalculation, a persistent systemic underestimation of how many people society would ultimately funnel toward this single hillside. And each generation responded the only way it knew how, by building more walls, wards, and wings, never quite catching up to the flood of need pressing in from every direction. Chapter 8: Behind the Windows. By the middle of the 20th century, Northampton State Hospital had reached a scale that would have been unimaginable to the reformers who first broke ground on the hillside nearly a century earlier. In 1952, the hospital reported serving 2,331 patients with a staff of just 509. Within a few short years, the population climbed even higher, eventually reaching approximately 2,500 patients, the highest concentration of people the hospital would ever house at a single time. By its peak, Northampton was operating at more than 12 times its intended capacity, a statistic that could never fully capture what daily life inside those overcrowded wards actually looked like. Psychiatrist Shirley Gallup arrived at Northampton from South Carolina in 1958 taking a position responsible for evaluating newly admitted women. She expected the assignment to last a year, perhaps two. She stayed for 28. What she found upon arrival was a hospital already bulging at the seams, overcrowded, underfunded, and physically deteriorating, even as it continued to admit new patients at a relentless pace. But what troubled Gallup most was not simply the volume of people crowded into the wards. It was who many of those people actually were. Years later, reflecting on her decades at the hospital, she would estimate that roughly 600 of the roughly 2,300 patients under her observation at any given time were elderly individuals who belonged in nursing homes rather than a psychiatric institution. They had no family able or willing to care for them, no other institution equipped to take them in, and so they simply aged inside Northampton's walls, absorbing institutional life so completely that many of them knew nothing else. The elderly were far from the only patients whose presence at Northampton reflected society's failures rather than genuine psychiatric need. Mothers suffering from what would today be recognized and treated as postpartum depression found themselves committed to the hospital's wards, their temporary struggles reframed as permanent insanity in an era with no legal framework requiring anything resembling due process before confinement. Patients who were simply physically disabled, deaf, unable to speak English, or judged by the standards of the time to have violated norms of feminine behavior or morality were funneled into the same overcrowded system, sharing wards with individuals experiencing genuine, severe psychiatric crises. There existed no meaningful legal protection, preventing someone from being involuntarily committed for reasons that had little or nothing to do with mental illness, as any modern clinician would define it. The hospital had become a warehouse, absorbing anyone society did not know how to care for through any other means. The physical conditions inside the wards reflected this reality with brutal clarity. Overcrowded rooms meant patients often had little privacy and even less individual attention from an overstretched staff. The back wards and infirmaries became repositories for the patients least likely to ever leave. Thorazine, when it arrived in 1952, offered genuine relief for some patients, calming symptoms that had previously gone entirely unmanaged, but its introduction did nothing to address the underlying structural crisis of a hospital built for 200 people now attempting to care for over 2,000. Medication could quiet a ward. It could not create more staff, space, or meaningful paths toward discharge and recovery. The hospital had reached its peak, but that peak looked nothing like the calm, dignified sanctuary imagined by the reformers of the 1850s. Chapter 9. The Man at the Window. The moment that would ultimately bring Northampton State Hospital's decades of quiet crisis into full public view began not with a lawmaker or a physician, but with a young attorney standing outside a locked window. Stephen Schwartz had come to the hospital as part of his early legal work advocating for patients' rights, and what he encountered that day would stay with him for the rest of his career. Standing at one of the hospital's windows, he found himself looking through iron mesh at a scene that seemed to belong to a different century entirely. A number of patients had pressed their faces directly against the glass, straining toward whatever daylight and open air lay beyond the mesh, desperate simply to get out. Schwartz later described the feeling that overtook him in that moment not as fear, but as something closer to a deep, paralyzing sense of pain. A nurse eventually approached, gently moved the patients aside, unlocked the door, and let him inside. What Schwartz found beyond that door confirmed every uneasy suspicion the view through the window had already raised. Walking the central corridor, he passed perhaps 40 patients, the vast majority of them either sitting or lying directly on the floor. The stench, Schwartz remembered, was overwhelming. The unmistakable smell of an institution stretched far beyond its ability to maintain even basic standards of care. None of the patients he passed wore their own clothing, only hospital gowns, stripped of even that small marker of individual identity, and several had been confined alone in locked rooms. It was in that corridor that Schwartz made a decision that would ultimately help bring the hospital's long era of unchecked overcrowding to an end. He knew in that moment that he needed to stay involved. That resolve translated into legal action a few years later. In 1976, attorneys working on behalf of hospital patients filed a class action lawsuit against the state, brought in the name of a patient named David Brewster and others confined alongside him. The lawsuit argued that patients possessed a constitutional right to receive treatment in the least restrictive environment reasonably available, rather than being warehoused indefinitely inside an overcrowded institution simply because society had no better alternative to offer them. The case drew on legal strategies and momentum already building elsewhere. Robert Fleischner, an attorney who worked alongside Schwartz through this period, would later describe the lawsuits as revolutionary in their willingness to imagine an entirely different model of care, one built around small group homes, housing just 8 or 9 residents rather than sprawling institutions housing thousands. On the 6th of January, 1978, the United States District Court formally approved a settlement that would become known as the Brewster Consent Decree. The agreement was unambiguous in its central demand. Northampton State Hospital was ordered to reduce its patient population from the thousands it had housed at its peak down to just 50 individuals, and it was given a timeline of 3 years to accomplish this reduction. It was one of the most dramatically mandated transformations any American psychiatric institution had ever faced, a legal order essentially requiring the hospital to dismantle the very system of mass institutional care it had spent more than a century building. Raymond P. Bryan, who served as regional director of the Department of Mental Health during this period, would later describe these years as intensely emotional for everyone involved, physicians, attorneys, administrators, and patients alike, all navigating a transformation that few had any real roadmap for accomplishing. Dr. Jeffrey Geller, who would go on to serve as the hospital's medical director beginning in 1979, helped draft portions of the original lawsuit before later joining the hospital staff specifically to help implement the consent decree from the inside. He recalled feeling a tremendous sense of excitement in the immediate aftermath of the ruling, a genuine belief that the hospital might finally be reshaped into something more humane. But that optimism would prove difficult to sustain against the sheer scale of what the decree actually demanded. Chapter 10. Emptying the Madhouse. The process ordered by the Brewster Consent Decree unfolded far more slowly than anyone involved in drafting it had anticipated. Even as the hospital worked to shrink its population toward the court-mandated goal, admissions did not simply stop. In 1980, Northampton State Hospital recorded its 64,500th admission since opening its doors more than a century earlier, a staggering figure that underscored just how many lives had passed through the institution, even as it now scrambled to discharge as many patients as possible. Those being released did not walk out into a community prepared to receive them. Patients were reassigned to smaller facilities where space existed, or in many cases, simply discharged outright, released into a Northampton community that was largely uninformed about mental illness and openly hostile toward the very people the consent decree was meant to help. For many former patients, the transition out of institutional life brought not the promised dignity of community integration, but poverty, isolation, and homelessness, immediate and visible consequences that quickly became the subject of citywide controversy. The human cost of this rapid transition reached a national audience in May of 1981, when Life magazine published a feature titled Emptying the Madhouse, bringing the struggles unfolding in towns like Northampton to readers across the entire country. The piece did not shy away from the darker realities of deinstitutionalization. It followed individuals like William Hopkins, a man who had cycled in and out of Northampton State Hospital 10 separate times, receiving no meaningful follow-up care between each admission. The article described him hallucinating between brief moments of clarity, disoriented and unsupervised on the streets, a vulnerable figure left exposed to thieves, taunting schoolchildren, and the ordinary dangers of city traffic. One psychiatry professor quoted in the piece offered a blunt assessment of the broader pattern playing out across the country, observing that while some discharged patients genuinely benefited from humane aftercare programs, the majority simply got dumped amid broken promises. Hopkins, the article made clear, was far from alone in that experience. Back in Northampton itself, The sudden visibility of former patients within the community stirred genuine anxiety among residents and local leaders alike. Then, Mayor David Musante voiced concerns shared by a portion of the town, worried that Northampton risked becoming what local graffiti at the time bluntly called a dumping ground for the mentally ill. These fears were not entirely abstract. Several troubling incidents, including fires deliberately set at halfway houses established to support discharged patients, reinforced public anxiety and led to organized efforts to slow or restrict the spread of group homes throughout the city. The debate played out publicly and often bitterly across newspaper editorial pages, in city council meetings, and around dinner tables throughout the region, as residents tried to reconcile genuine compassion for the mentally ill with very real concerns about safety, resources, and the sudden, unplanned nature of the transition unfolding around them. Amid this charged atmosphere, individual stories offered a more complicated, more human picture than the fear-driven headlines often allowed. Rebecca McCauley, a former patient who had once been hospitalized, later spoke openly about the deep stigma she and other former patients carried during this period. She described how many people connected to the hospital privately kept what they called an anti-resume, a private, unspoken record of every hospitalization, treatment endured, and institutional experience accumulated over years or even decades of contact with the system. Macaulay's own anti-resume included 5 separate hospitalizations at Northampton State Hospital alone, alongside additional admissions at a nearby veterans medical facility. Rather than remain silent, she eventually chose to speak publicly, writing a letter to the local newspaper describing what she called a witch hunt underway in Northampton, one that sought to blame the mentally ill broadly for problems the entire community was struggling to address together. That letter sparked a public exchange between Macaulay and Mayor Musante, an exchange that eventually led her to arrive at his office for what she expected would be a confrontation. Instead, the two ended up talking and in the process became close friends, an outcome Macaulay would later point to as proof that healing, however difficult, remained possible even in a community as divided and anxious as Northampton was during those years. Reflecting on the broader arc of the hospital's decline, Macaulay offered a verdict that captured the tragedy of the entire institution more completely than almost any statistic ever could. Northampton State Hospital, she said, stood as an example of failed social policy, an idea that had seemed reasonable enough at its inception, but which no one had looked far enough down the road to fully understand, leaving an entire community to live with the consequences of that short-sightedness for generations to come. Chapter 11. The Silence of Old Main. As the population of Northampton State Hospital continued its long, uneven decline through the 1980s, the original building at the heart of the institution reached the natural end of its purpose. Old Main had by this point been continuously occupied and expanded for 130 years. Its wings had witnessed the entire arc of the hospital's history, from the optimistic overcrowding of its very first weeks, through Pliny Earle's quiet doubts, through the relentless expansions of the early 20th century, and finally into the desperate overcrowding of its mid-century peak. In 1986, with the population reduction ordered by the Brewster Consent Decree well underway, Old Main was formally abandoned. The wards that had once held hundreds of patients at a time fell silent. That silence was not gentle. Visitors and former staff who returned to the building in the years that followed described an atmosphere that felt less like peaceful retirement and more like abandonment, frozen mid-motion. Hallways that had once carried the daily rhythms of institutional life now carried only the occasional sound of wind slamming a loose door somewhere deep within the structure, or the shriek of rusted air vents no longer maintained by any staff. Furniture remained in some rooms exactly where it had been left. Paint peeled from walls that had once been kept in careful order to satisfy the aesthetic demands of moral treatment philosophy. The building that had been designed around the belief that beautiful surroundings could heal the mind now stood as a monument to decay, its own physical deterioration mirroring the institutional collapse of the philosophy that had built it. Yet even as Old Main fell dark, the hospital as a whole did not immediately cease to exist. Operations continued at Memorial Complex. For 7 more years, a shrinking population of patients continued to receive care within those newer buildings, even as the broader deinstitutionalization movement steadily reduced their numbers year after year. Staff who remained through this period often described a strange, hollow atmosphere, an institution visibly winding down, its hallways emptier with each passing year, its future increasingly uncertain as state officials debated what should ultimately become of the sprawling campus on the Hill. That final chapter arrived on the 26th of August, 1993. On that day, the last remaining patients, a group numbering somewhere between 11 and 12 individuals depending on the account, were formally discharged and reassigned to other facilities better suited to their ongoing care. A van door closed behind them, an unremarkable, almost anticlimactic ending for an institution that had once housed more than 2,500 people at a single time. After 135 years of continuous operation, Northampton State Hospital officially closed its doors for good. There was no grand ceremony to mark the occasion, no gathering of dignitaries comparable to the cornerstone, laying that had launched the institution nearly a century and a half earlier. The hospital that had opened amid such genuine hope for reform and healing simply, quietly, stopped. What remained on the hillside was no longer a working institution at all, but a vast, silent complex of aging buildings, still standing, still visible from town, holding within their walls more than a century of history that the community below was only beginning to fully reckon with. Chapter 12: Cemetery Hill. Not every story connected to Northampton State Hospital ended with a discharge, reassignment, or return to family. For hundreds of patients who died during their time on the Hill, the hospital itself became responsible for their final resting place. From the earliest decades of its operation until sometime in the 1920s, the hospital maintained its own burial ground on a quiet slope just outside the main campus, a section of Hillside that would come to be known simply as Cemetery Hill. It was here that the institution buried the patients it could not save and could not even properly name. The scale of what happened on that hillside remained obscure for decades, buried as thoroughly as the patients themselves beneath layers of institutional record-keeping that treated the dead with the same bureaucratic distance the hospital had so often shown the living. Historical research would eventually confirm 181 individual burials at the site, each one a patient who had lived within the hospital's walls, and each one laid to rest without a headstone bearing their name. In many cases, graves were marked only with small numbered stakes or simple metal markers corresponding to admission records kept elsewhere, a system that allowed the hospital to technically track where each body had been placed, while stripping away any public acknowledgement of who that person had actually been. Visitors walking the hillside today would have found no names to read, no dates of birth, no epitaphs, nothing resembling the basic dignity a cemetery typically extends to those it holds. This anonymity reflected something deeper than simple administrative oversight. It reflected the broader pattern that had defined so much of the hospital's history, a slow, steady erasure of individual identity in service of institutional efficiency. Patients admitted to Northampton often arrived already stripped of family connection, financial resources, or social standing. The elderly with no relatives able to care for them, the poor who could afford no other form of treatment, immigrants who spoke no English and had no advocate to speak for them. For many of these individuals, institutionalization itself had already begun the process of erasing their place in the world beyond the hospital walls. Death simply completed that erasure, burying them not only beneath the earth of Cemetery Hill, but beneath the additional weight of a system that had never fully recorded them as individuals worth remembering in the first place. For nearly a century after the burial ground closed in the 1920s, this quiet corner of the hospital grounds received almost no formal acknowledgement at all. A temporary marker was placed at the site in 1959, offering only the barest indication that anyone was buried there at all. It would remain the primary marker for the site for nearly 6 decades, largely unnoticed by a public that had, by then, mostly forgotten the hospital existed at all. That began to change on the 21st of October, 2017, when the Northampton Historical Commission formally dedicated a new memorial bench overlooking Cemetery Hill, replacing the aging temporary marker with something more permanent, and more intentional. The bench itself made no claim to individual names, since so few of those names had ever been reliably preserved in any accessible record. But its placement represented something the burial ground had never truly received in the centuries since the first patient was laid to rest there. A formal, public acknowledgement that these were people, that they had lived, suffered, and died within the same institution built on a promise of healing, and that the hillside holding their remains deserved to be remembered as something more than empty, overgrown ground. It was the closest thing to an apology the hospital's story would ever receive. Chapter 13, Ashes of a Dream. In the years immediately following the hospital's closure in 1993, the sprawling, empty campus on the hillside became the subject of an increasingly urgent question: what should become of it? Former Northampton City Councilor Mike Kirby helped form a group called Save Old Main, dedicated to restoring and preserving the original hospital building for future generations. The group organized walking tours of the abandoned grounds, sharing the institution's history with a public that seemed genuinely curious about what had happened on the hill above their town. Not everyone shared the same vision for the site's future. As homelessness in Northampton grew into a pressing local concern during the 1990s, some community members argued the vacant buildings should be repurposed as shelter for those in need. On the 15th of April, 1996, this tension boiled over into direct action when 6 young activists were arrested for trespassing after attempting to occupy a building on the grounds known as the Earle Street Building. They hoped the occupation would draw attention to using the space as transitional housing. The hospital's chief of security responded firmly, warning that further attempts to enter the vacated buildings would result in prosecution. Community forums continued through the following months, including a September gathering at the Northampton Center for the Arts and a November conference held at a local church, both dedicated to brainstorming solutions to the city's growing homelessness crisis. Amid these practical debates over the property's future, the hospital's history received a more symbolic form of acknowledgement. On the 17th and 18th of November, in the year 2000, Northampton hosted a 2-day memorial event titled The State Hospital, in memoriam, combining an academic symposium featuring psychiatrists and mental health professionals with an open forum where former patients themselves were finally given space to share their own experiences of institutional life. The event closed with something unlike anything the hospital grounds had witnessed before: a sound installation created by visual artist Anna Schuleit-Haber, deliberately timed to reference the laying of the original cornerstone back in 1856. Attendees walked in procession toward the empty old main building. At noon, church bells across Northampton rang together in a unified moment of silence, followed by a 28-minute installation titled Habeas Corpus, in which speakers placed inside the empty abandoned building played Johann Sebastian Bach's Magnificat, filling the same silent hallways that had once carried the noise of daily institutional life with music instead. A haunting, deliberate act of remembrance for everyone who had ever passed through those doors. Despite these preservation efforts, city administrators ultimately chose demolition over restoration. In 2006, Old Main was finally torn down. During the demolition process, workers recovered the original cornerstone, along with its time capsule, still sealed after a century and a half of undisturbed rest. Its contents, including printed pamphlets such as a report on insanity and idiocy in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, survived largely intact and now reside at Forbes Library, one of the only physical remnants connecting the modern town to the building's earliest days. By the following summer, Memorial Complex had been demolished as well, erasing the last significant structures of an institution that had once dominated the hillside for well over a century. In their place rose a mixed apartment and condominium development given the name Village Hill, while a portion of the former Memorial Complex grounds was purchased by a local defense contractor, eventually absorbed into one of the largest defense companies in the entire United States. Where wards once held thousands of patients, families now moved into modern housing, largely unaware of exactly what had once stood and what had once been buried beneath the ground they now called home. Chapter 14, a hillside remembered. Today, if you drive up the hill outside Northampton, you will find no crumbling brick towers, no long, silent corridors, no trace of the sprawling institution that once dominated this landscape for 135 years. Instead, you will find a quiet residential development, tree-lined streets and office buildings belonging to a defense contractor, ordinary signs of ordinary modern life laid gently over ground that carries a far heavier history than most of its current residents will ever know. This is the final irony of Northampton State Hospital's story. A place built on the belief that beautiful, carefully designed surroundings could heal a troubled mind has been replaced by beautiful, carefully designed surroundings meant simply to house families, with almost nothing remaining to connect the two. The story of this hospital is not a story of villains. It is a story of good intentions, slowly buckling under the impossible weight of scale, underfunding, and a society that too often preferred to build another ward, rather than confront the deeper question of why so many people needed one in the first place. From its opening weeks in 1858, when 220 patients arrived against a design meant to hold 200, to its final closing on the 26th of August, 1993, the hospital never fully escaped that founding tension between ambition and capacity, between the world reformers imagined and the world they actually built. Perhaps nowhere is that tension more visible than on Cemetery Hill, where 181 men and women rest beneath ground that, for most of a century, offered them not even the dignity of a name. They arrived at Northampton as patients, and in many cases, they left it only as numbers on a burial record, their individual stories dissolved into the institution's much larger, colder story of overcrowding and quiet neglect. The bench placed there in 2017 cannot restore what was lost. It cannot give back the names that were never properly recorded, or the years those patients spent largely forgotten by the outside world. But it stands at least as an acknowledgement that they were there, that they mattered, and that the hillside above Northampton, however peaceful it may look today, was once a place where hundreds of people were failed by the very promise built to save them.